Welcome to Sumbits, where we decode the PowerSchool development experience. Sumbits is brought to you by MBA. Let's start the show.
Welcome, everybody. My name's Sean Cawby. I'm joined here with Eric Schaitel and Ryan Cockrem. And today, we wanted to take a look and look at the history of PowerSchool code and kind of the evolution of where it's been since we started. And I think a good point to start on that is kind of give everybody an idea of where exactly we did start. I think Eric's been around PowerSchool longer than the other two of us. So Eric, you want to start, give us an idea of kind of where you came into the PowerSchool world and how you came about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined MBA, never been actually an employee within a school district itself, but I joined MBA back in 2009. So it's been a little over a decade now. Came into the company fresh out of tech school, learning coding, learning web development as a customizer for PowerSchool. So back in 2009, as I recall, I believe at the time we were on PowerSchool version 5 point something. And just been doing the customization and even dabbled in some state reporting development since then. And that's the history. That's where I started. That's where I still am today.
Right on. How about you, Ryan?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing I say is the longer you've been in PowerSchool customizations, the less hair you have. So, you know, it's a good segue.
Was that a dig? I think that was a dig.
We want to set the tone, let everyone know what they're getting into here.
The best part is Eric actually got his hair cut for this.
I did. I cut my hair this morning, I'll have you know. Thank you very much.
And how much did you cut off there, Eric?
As much as I possibly could. So for those that aren't seeing the video, it's just basically a hair trimmers with no guard, neck up. It's a beautiful thing.
He specifies neck up because he likes to be like Bushman down below. Anyways, so yeah, my name's Ryan Cockrem. As far as being into PowerSchool, I came in through a district. I started up in a district. I went into there actually as a kind of a software technician, and I went to school for network administration. And that would have been about 2009 as well. I started in the district in 2009 anyways. By about 2010, 2011, they were asking me to find a better solution to their 30-year-old antiquated student information system. And after some research, PowerSchool became the one I chose and endorsed, and they went with it. And ever since then, I kind of put all my eggs in that basket with it and kept going and kept learning and got better as a developer and did some things on my own, did some things with other folks, and now here I am at MBA.
Right on.
I'm so happy to have you.
Actually, what's that?
I said we're just so happy to have you.
Yeah. Well,
and then finally, of course, we have our producer, Sean, who introduced himself briefly earlier. Sean, what's your background, good sir?
So I started with the school district in 2006-ish. And I was basically kind of like Ryan. I was more of on the network side. And then long story short, they were pulling state reporting back from the secretaries and giving it to a central area. Just came into the tech department. Literally my superintendent said, "Hey, Sean, you're good with numbers. This is yours now." A couple years later, or within 2 years, after I kept on asking for more and more rights to PowerSchool, the PowerSchool admin at the time, which was the tech director, looked at me and said, "Hey, why don't you just be the admin for it?" Okay, that doesn't sound like too difficult of a thing. And yeah, so kind of years and years go by. Start into the development aspect of things, start realizing the power of PowerSchool, and realizing all the things that we can do with it. And here we are in 2020, and I'm working for MBA. And as most PowerSchool users can probably agree, you've probably seen us all sipping a little something. Most PowerSchool users are going to enjoy a cocktail here and there. Whiskey is usually my drink of choice. Today is wild turkey rare breed. I think the other two fellows are more beer drinkers.
Indeed, as a Wisconsinite, it's a crime not to be. So I stopped by the store last night myself. I picked up a Leinenkugel's Toasted Bock. This is my first foray into this particular brew from Leinenkugel's, which is a Wisconsin local brewery, I believe Chippewa Falls. It's quite tasty. I highly recommend it.
And I've jumped into a Canadian a craft brew, Forgotten Lake out of Lake of the Woods. It's a blueberry ale, and I am not one for fruity and sweet beers, and this does not do that. I'm one for blueberries, and this offers just hints of blueberry in a strong ale of a 7.1%. I quite enjoy it.
I'm just curious, are you going to change your shirt every time you change beers to match, or?
I don't have enough down here, but we could make that a thing next time around.
So we didn't really talk about where everybody's from. Obviously, Eric referred to himself as a Wisconsinite. That is where...
You can say cheesehead. It's okay.
So I'm a Bears fan, so I'm not going to even reference that. So that's not necessarily a thing to be proud of this year, but it is what it is. And if you couldn't tell by Ryan's accent, he does...
What accent?
Come to us
what are you all talking about?
From the Great White North. Manitoba, right?
Winnipeg, Manitoba. Yeah, the just north of North Dakota.
Right. And I'm just south of Chicago, but on the Indiana side. So I'm in a tiny little town in northwest Indiana. So anyway, back to the topic at hand. We all kind of started in PowerSchool in a little different spot. Eric said, PowerSchool 5 is where he started. I think when I started, we were just getting into PowerSchool 7. Definitely even changes between PowerSchool 5 and PowerSchool 7 were pretty huge. If you can think back to some of those early projects you were working on, Eric, what was kind of some of the hurdles that you were dealing with back then, or what are some of the changes that you've seen kind of in those early days?
Well, it was interesting in the early days when I started with MBA, my predecessor was gone. He had left the company. And unlike now, we've grown a lot over the last 10 years. I was the only developer at the time, so I had no one to feed off of, to feed me that information. So I learned a lot by trial and error. That was definitely my biggest challenge. A lot of it was, we had some folks in the office. We did PowerSchool support and state reporting for the state of Wisconsin at the time. We didn't even have a footprint outside of the state. So it was all internal to the state of Wisconsin. Everybody that worked for us, unlike the Canucks that we have now, is that an okay word to say? That's not offensive, is it?
It's completely offensive. It's detrimental to my mother and my forefathers, and it's not a problem at all.
Okay, great. We'll just edit that out later.
I thought America was the only one that had forefathers.
Actually, I honestly don't know. Who knows? It might be, to be perfectly honest.
That was an interesting challenge at the time, though. For me, I learned a little bit about where customizations were placed in the custom web root at the time. At the time, custom page management didn't even exist, and I learned a lot from just looking at other resources, looking at other people's code, looking at existing pages. So that was definitely the biggest challenge, is trying to figure out how to customize PowerSchool. And it was probably about a year after I started before I attended my first PSU, where I actually had some PowerSchool training on how to customize PowerSchool. And one of the things that always sticks with me from that training, and something that I think that's gotten better over the years, so I remember sitting through a class on PowerSchool customization and learning about TList SQL and learning about PSHTML, the custom PowerSchool tags that we use within our HTML documents. And I learned so much in an hour and a half. And I went up to the instructor afterwards and I said, this was amazing. There's just such a wealth of knowledge in here. Where is this documented? How do you know all of this? And he looked at me and he said, tribal knowledge. And I'm not one to shoot the messenger, but I kind of wanted to deck the guy at the time because
So
I knew
tribalknowledge.com or net.
I think it was a .ca. Right,
Yeah.
right.
So
I think it was a Canadian-based website at the time.
Wouldn't have been that point yet.
But it was really frustrating for me at the time because I'd been with PowerSchool long enough to know that they really sold their product based on the fact that it was customizable. That was one of the big selling points for PowerSchool, and that's great. And I completely understand their policy of not supporting customizations, but if you're going to sell a product based on the fact that it's customizable, I really felt like that should be documented somewhere. And I feel like that's evolved over the years and gotten much better. But at the time, it was super frustrating. That was a huge challenge for me, I guess, is accumulating that knowledge of how to approach, even when you understand web development basics, how you approach that from a PowerSchool customization perspective.
Yeah.
And this was back in the day of PowerSchool 5. So for those that have been around that long, that would be back in the day when we had all the pinstripes in PowerSchool. I refer to it as the Yankee days. Isn't it the Yankees that always had the pinstripes on their uniforms? It always made me think of the New York Yankees.
That's a baseball team. I know that's not real big up there. So
Just one team.
You got the Blue Jays, man.
Yeah, the one team.
I don't know that they ever had pinstripes. But that's the first major kind of evolution that I remember of PowerSchool was, I think it was the progression, guys correct me if I'm wrong, from 6 to 7, where they went from the pinstripes to completely kind of overhauling their user interface.
right.
So that was really interesting, and that was a big step in the right direction.
Well, and that's right there. That's when I got into PowerSchool, and our district, we were signing on at the end of life for PowerSchool 6, right when PowerSchool 7 had been released. It was over that summer, and I remember, because we were talking about the pros and the positives and the negatives here, the frustrations. So I went to PSU that summer. My district ponied up and sent me out there, and as you know, they'll typically do all of their training, everything on the new version, but they also advised our district to not move to 7. To implement everything on 6, I guess, because that's the framework they had. That's what they knew they could support and everything. So I went up to. I was in San Diego. Was the first one I went to. I mean, beautiful place and fantastic setup and everything. But I learned everything on 7. I remember there was one specific. It was during the object reports training, which I don't deal with at all anymore, which was one of the reasons I wanted to learn how to customize, so I didn't have to deal with object reports either. But object reports, I remember there was this function to rerun the report if you went into the report queue, which was introduced in 7, but I didn't catch that because it was all fresh and new, and I was on 6. So I remember having to make all the report cards, but I couldn't not do that rerun. And I remember all the extra clicks I would have to do just to rerun every single time I made a change to my object report. And but then 7 came, and that was when all the changes happened. That was when all the magic happened. The pinstripes were gone, like you said. And I remember there was a couple old screens in our district that would stick. That's how I knew. I was like, oh, I must have hit customize on that one in CPM a while back, and then not done anything about it, because whenever you navigate to that one, all of a sudden, pinstripes.
Yeah.
Can I just say, once or twice, maybe 3 times over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been on a client server and seen pinstripes.
I was just going to say, at some of the PSUGs, I've been at a lot of PSUGs in the last, 6-7 years, and I usually do like the help desk or the one-on-ones, and at least one every PSUG that I go to, I have somebody that comes in and they, and a lot of times, honestly, they will come up and say, we don't want to change this because it works, but we're having an issue with it. And then they navigate to that page, and it's back to the pinstripes. And it's always at least one district that I deal with every PSUG that has at least one customized page that still has that. I even had one that didn't even realize, or it just never clicked to them that they had that old of a customization. They just thought that's what that customized page looked like. And it just was what it was. And they weren't concerned about it at all. And I was like, wow, okay, you need to do some updating.
I knew exactly. Now you have to, this is perfect into what's new in PowerSchool. Like, I mean, you got to convince them, like, you got your page fragments now, you got your insertion points, you got all of the extra CSS and everything that will make your life better. You just need to spend a little bit of time now to convert that. And granted, I mean, it's especially the older back it goes. It's like, it's one of those things, the longer you leave it, the harder it is to rip that Band-Aid off.
Right.
But it's worth it in the long run.
Yeah, and I think that lends to, something else I want to talk about. Eric, you talked about it a little bit. Resources. The longer you've been around PowerSchool, the amount of resources that are available now is way beyond what, even when any of us started. I remember back when I was starting, I wasn't necessarily a developer. I came in being network, and you were talking about object reports. That was the big handoff when I became the PowerSchool administrator, is I'm the one that got the ruler. Here's the ruler for you to do object reports.
Everyone did, as far as I'm concerned.
I was like, wait, you got to do what? Anyway. But, back then, even when we were looking at things to improve PowerSchool,
this ruler has seen many an object report specifically back in the day.
It was like a steel ruler.
Well, I learned to get a clear one because you can see through the lines. So you could actually see where you were lining up on the lines, because if you had the steel one, you couldn't see. So this made it easier when you wanted to find those specific points. That way it was transparent. I didn't have to guess as much.
See, that's why you get paid the big bucks. But so when I started, and hearing about the customizations, there wasn't anything that I was developing. So, the places that and it wasn't until I went to, Eric talked about PSUs. I didn't go to a PSUG conference until many years later. So my start was with PSUs. And then you start hearing about these websites like, powerdatasolutions.org and, sites like that. You're right.
Nope. I still have it.
Still have it. And then you start seeing like, hey, there's these customizations and resources out there. What, Eric, you already said that, there really wasn't much of anything out there for you. And even when you did go to a PSU, your resource was, tribal knowledge. What resources did you use when you first started, Ryan?
My biggest resources were like PowerSource. Really, like I would go to the PSUs, but it was PowerSource, because that was like, so in my province, first of all, too, like we were one of three original, like we were the third, if you go by, the district IDs, and we were 003. And then we'd go to the PSUs, we'd learn stuff, but then I'd go on PowerSource, and we were told about actually like PowerSchool. The implementation managers and the salespeople told us about the PSUG forums, the Yahoo user group at the time, because now it's what is it now?
Groups.io.
Yeah. So back when it was Yahoo, they told us about it, and I was signed on right away. I remember I'd follow it, and then I'd ask a question and no one would answer me, because my questions were just that, asinine. And look, I could find some of my stuff, and I really had no clue what I was asking when I was doing back then. And people probably looked at me and were like, "I don't even know how to answer that. I don't even know how to interpret that."
I'll let somebody else touch that.
Yeah. So, those were some of my resources, but really, what it came down to was, I guess, the same mentality of the PSUG group, and then just PowerSource in general. We started a monthly get together in our province of the other districts, which grew substantially, and we would get together and answer each other's problems and can compare notes. And it's, everything PowerSchool I've always found it's a group effort. Like it really is. It continues to be to this day, to the PSUG events that we go to. There's not a single time, I can speak for anybody who's gone, there's not a single time you've gone where you haven't learned something from somebody else and haven't had, as advanced and as far as you are. And there's developers way beyond me as far as I'm concerned, and they themselves still find themselves learning things and going, that's new. I didn't know that. And it happens to me all the time. I'm glad. I love it. So I guess my biggest resource is a PowerSource, but it's been people in general. It's been in people and connecting and networking and all that.
Now that you guys have been kind of in the weeds and really developing inside of PowerSchool for a while, what kind of resources do you use now? I know, like, towards my later days, before I worked for MBA, I was using Eric customization documentation plugin. I used the crap out of that to do, the small things. Is there anything out there that you use? I mean, obviously, we have a team of developers here that you can rely on as well, but
that's it.
Are there any go-tos out there?
The biggest change. So, as far as evolution of PowerSchool customizations go, one of the biggest changes is that now they include or implement actual like web standards, development standards. So back when I was starting, back when Eric was starting, back when you were starting on development, you were always having to balance that fine line of doing web development, with like basically HTML tables, and then PSHTML and TList and everything like that. But if you needed actual answers to your questions, you weren't going to find them on Google or Stack Exchange. Nowadays, because Angular and full out JavaScript, like everything is now, it's kind of gone the other way. Whereas before it was web development inside a PowerSchool world, now it's PowerSchool inside of a web development world. So now when you need to solve your problems, your research, your troubleshooting doesn't have to be PowerSchool specific. So now you can actually use the World Wide Web as your knowledge source, which I've so I mean, it's what I use nowadays. It's actual web development knowledge. And I mean, even when you look on the forums, when you look on people talking now people just, there's the PowerSchool gotchas, but it's like, here's a function that's available from JavaScript that'll do this, or here's something new that's been introduced in the latest version of SQL that you can use to do this, and those will solve you, whereas before those weren't necessarily options.
I would agree with that, and also stress where you said, there are also the PowerSchool gotchas. It is nice to see PowerSchool going into more of a standard web development approach. I think that adds its own challenges, especially in that, the migration to an Angular-based application, which is happening in PowerSchool. I think it's a great thing. The concepts behind the Angular JavaScript framework are really modern web application concepts. It's nice to see it moving in that direction. It also obfuscates a few things and does make customization, I feel, more challenging when there are specific ways that we have to now customize to accommodate customization within PowerTeacher Pro, or if you want to customize contacts. Whereas it does make things more challenging, especially, I think, for those that know, as we always say, just enough to be dangerous.
There you go. That's what I was waiting to. I was going to interject quickly there, and I want to let you finish that for sure. But you're right. It makes it more challenging, but it makes it more challenging, and not just for the people just to be dangerous, but for the people who, like, if Angular was part of it when I started developing with PowerSchool, when I started customizing PowerSchool, I wouldn't have made it to where I am now. It was because it was like back with 7, 8, 9, whatever. There was, relatively speaking, training wheels on it, like, because of how PSHTML was and how it was a PowerSchool platform that used web standards. Now that it's flipped, now that Angular is a very core piece, it's a whole different ballgame if you're somebody with zero web development skills, which I was back then, and now trying to figure that out, because that's just a more complex beast.
Yeah, and for some of our listeners who might not be as deep into the JavaScript world, I want to talk for a minute, I guess, if I could, for those that are maybe a little fuzzy on what we're talking about when we talk about modern web standards and Angular JS. So, I mean, JavaScript in general, of course, is our language within the browser that allows us to make our web pages interactive. So how does that differ from something like jQuery, which you've probably heard of all the time, or AngularJS, which we've just been talking about? And at the end of the day, the answer is it's all just JavaScript. But there are libraries and frameworks out there like jQuery and AngularJS that allow us to do more with less code. Basically allow us to use code that professional master programmers have developed and leverage that within our applications to write less code and just do more. So understanding JavaScript was kind of, I think, as a developer, your first hurdle. After HTML and CSS, of course, but then once you get a basic understanding of that, you can start to understand some of these libraries. And for me, after about 8 years of having been a developer in a professional arena, learning Angular was really still a challenge for me. And one of those things that, honestly, I read a book about it, and the book made complete sense as I was reading it, but when you sit down and try to apply those concepts, until you've done it, it hasn't really sunk in.
That was like every class I ever took at PSUGs or PSUs. Like, you sit through it and you go, oh, yeah, I know this. Like, I don't even have to take notes. I know this. And then you go home and you're like, all right, how do I use that?
Where do I start again?
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that in case we had some listeners out there that, maybe they are those people that they're like, yeah, that's me. I know just enough to be dangerous, and I keep hearing this this Angular thing. So I wanted to maybe kind of demystify that a little bit. I think it was a huge step in the right direction, and it made a lot of things easier. I think it also introduced some challenges. Like I say, to me, the big two things that stick out are PowerTeacher Pro and student contacts customization.
Yeah.
There's actually, and kind of back to something we were talking about earlier, we were talking about the resources that are available to us now that weren't before. There's actually a developer site now that PowerSchool's introduced, and I think that was a huge step in the right direction.
Absolutely.
And stepping away from this whole tribal knowledge concept, like let's share this. So for anyone that doesn't know, the developer site documents certain things about customization of PowerSchool as well as the PowerSchool API. Now I'm going to toot my own horn here for a second. I want to. I was actually really flattered one time. Brian Andel from PowerSchool reached out to me and asked if he could use some of the concepts that I had put in my customization reference that Sean was mentioning earlier, and I think that was kind of part of the inspiration for part of that developer site, where they have documented some uses of PS-HTML. T-list, which is strongly deprecated, by the way, according to the developer site.
You just bit my carrot.
Oh, I'm sorry, man.
He's been waiting the whole time just to say it.
No, I was waiting for you. I just wanted to see if you'd bite it if I dangled it there. You did.
So there's actually, though, when we talk about PT Pro and student contacts, there are actually pages within that developer site dedicated to how to customize those two sections of PowerSchool.
Yep.
And I wonder sometimes how that's going to grow over time as more and more of PowerSchool migrates to this Angular architecture. Is there going to be a specific way to customize this versus that versus this?
Right.
And that is scary to me. I'm not saying it's a bad thing that they're going to Angular. I'm just saying that it does give me a little bit of pause sometimes. Yeah,
I'm right there with you because, as someone that doesn't know Angular, looking at that progression and looking at how PowerSchool has changed, when I got into doing some simple customizations and, doing the simple HTML things and doing the simple CSS things and really getting into JavaScript and jQuery and making some changes on screen, that was something as me who worked for a school district, not as a developer, because schools don't necessarily hire developers, right? If anything, there may be a development class that you may want to leverage, so some of the listeners out there, may take that for what it's worth and, maybe lean on some of your development classes to do some PowerSchool customization. But I didn't feel, and I don't feel like Angular is necessarily something that someone could learn necessarily like on the side. in the short amount of time that it would take to learn enough JavaScript to really make a difference in a PowerSchool customization. So like I'm right there with you. I see what you guys have done with Angular, and I do see the power of it. But I'm right there with you. It is a little worrisome for the, we talk about armchair quarterbacks. What about the armchair developers, the ones that just have a little bit of time to kind of dive in and maybe learn a thing or two to do some simple customizations? I think that's going to become more difficult if they move more towards Angular.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely I agree with that all. And like, I mean, my own, the genesis of my understanding of Angular and JavaScript was all through PowerSchool. Like, and it was all slow. Like, it wasn't like, definitely, it wasn't an overnight thing. And even like I would take web development classes because I mean, I genuinely wanted to advance my skill set. So I would take night classes and stuff on it. But even then, it didn't just click to me. I don't want to name drop, but I'll camouflage the name Schmadam Schmarson. If
well done, well,
everyone knows Schmadam Schmarson.
Okay.
I credit him honestly. I mean, in an indirect way, and I told him this once. It was like he literally sent me some stuff on Fusion charts.
Adam, if you're listening, you are not that big of a deal.
You're not that big of a deal. I heard the story, but it was he sent me some documentation on Fusion charts, and it was actually the JSON code that he sent me. It was something about having to really pour over all of the syntax on that, which finally made JavaScript click to me for whatever reason, and that's kind of where I went. And then Angular, my first actual introduction to this was at one of the PowerSchool, what did they call it, advanced. It was the successor to an old customizations deal that they do some Summit, but this was at the PSUs. It was a PowerSchool customization. What's that?
Was it Edge?
No, that's way before Edge.
Before that.
It was a PowerSchool Customizations Academy, and it was 2 days of, I don't know, were PSUs 4 days or 3 days? 4 days. So it was the latter half. Yeah, it was the latter half of the PSUs, and so the two other, that half was all dedicated to this academy thing, and they'd have a project, which was, I mean, it was great, and they expected you to know a decent amount before going, and I did, at least as far as HTML and JavaScript goes. But that's when I got introduced to Angular, and the whole point of that whole deal was to build a plugin to display standards and things like that. And I mean, I learned a lot from that, and like definitely wasn't a master by the time I left, but I got my feet dipped in, and then I went home, went back to my district and just kept playing with it. And I mean, I'd work all day, and then I'd come home in the evening, and then I'd mess around with it more in the night, and I'd come up with all kinds of nonsense. And I mean, it was all stuff that was genuinely helpful, but I mean, I think it was funny because the district I was working in, I had outgrown, as far as a developer goes, their need for what I could do or what I was trying to do. So they very graciously tried to accommodate me.
Hey, Ryan, can you step
and
your head's growing a little bit. You need to keep you in frame.
Oh, what, are you joking? Or they're very gracious.
You're growing head right now. That's all.
Okay. No, they very graciously tried to accommodate my desire to grow. But I mean, it was a small district. It's not like they could afford to have me be this full-time developer all the time. So I eventually looked for another option. I mean, I found it, and I mean, that ultimately led me here, and that's why it's great there. But I mean, that's I mean, Angular really was, I feel, the platform that I focused on and mastered to get me from, working in the district as a person who didn't enjoy network administration that much to being a developer. Yeah, well, I mean, just the dry stuff, right? Like I enjoy being creative. So I mean, and I think anyone who fancies at all being in customizations of PowerSchool and development, I mean, there's someone who wants to be creative. There's someone who wants to put their mind to power, to use, and there you go.
So I'm curious, do you guys feel like Angular is like the biggest and best move that PowerSchool's made, or is there anything in particular that comes to mind that sticks out as like the best thing that PowerSchool did?
Just before we jump off Angular, because we will here right away, I would say Angular has been a significant portion, but I think we've kind of been expressing a lot that despite it being powerful and more robust, included in PowerSchool, and robust in PowerSchool, it's been a bit of a hindrance to the everyman developer, like every person developer, let's say, but it hasn't accommodated everyone, and the people that were in my shoes when I started developing are going to find themselves a lot more challenged, because simply, like when I started, simply knowing and getting your way around HTML and CSS isn't as much help now, because sometimes now you got to compete with an Angular page, and all of a sudden that HTML knowledge kind of gets a little bit lost in there when you're trying to figure out what's going on with the Angular.
You make a great point. So when I think about, I was a quick no, Sean, when you asked if Angular was the greatest thing that they'd done, because honestly, for me, Angular was a revolution when I learned how to use it in my own customizations and my own pages that are entirely customized. For me, if anything else, it was more of a challenge, a hurdle when it came to customizing existing pages. Most of my development has always revolved around creating my own pages, and Angular is a framework that, if you know it, can make you so much more efficient and better at creating your own pages. But for those that don't know Angular, if you're just creating your own pages, you can achieve everything that you can with Angular with just jQuery without Angular. And you can achieve everything that you can achieve with jQuery without jQuery with plain vanilla JavaScript. It's all just JavaScript. It's just other people's libraries and functions that we're providing ourselves access to. So I think it was a good move on PowerSchool's part, and I think it probably helped them to progress the product more quickly from a core standpoint. From a customization standpoint, I don't feel like it had a major impact. There are a few things that I would say that really jump to the forefront of my mind when I say the major steps forward in PowerSchool's architecture in accommodating customization and making customization better. Ryan, I think, or maybe it was you, Sean, earlier alluded to insertion points and page fragments, ginormous. Yep. And the other one is when they migrated from custom fields and it's escaping me now, virtual tables to database extensions. I mean, that was huge.
Schema extensions.
Schema extensions.
Call them what they're supposed to be called. But yes.
It was initially schema extensions, and then they decided it would sound better as database extensions.
That's exactly it. They thought.
Because what's a schema?
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree. I personally think of those two items that you said there. I think the page fragments and insertion points were the most pivotal introduction to changing the landscape. Because yes, the extensions were great.
More so CPM. CPM being and not having to do what use
actually. Yeah,
I mean CPM. I think that's a different classification almost. Like, because I mean that is huge. But like what that did was make it more easily customizable through your actual web browser, which is huge. But I mean that's like almost like that's the home run of it. Like I mean that's the big huge change, and that was important. But it's unfair to compare that almost to the insertion points and the
interfacing versus actual like code development.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and so my big thing with the fragments and the insertion points is that just made management and development like infinitely more easy. Like even if you didn't have the extensions and you're still living with the old custom fields, you could still do whether the custom fields exist now or not, the page fragments and insertion points would still be just as impactful. Because sure. You'd be writing your SQL a little differently, and you'd be referencing fields a little differently, but it would still be all done through insertion points and page fragments, and you wouldn't be sitting there with a highlighter every time a new version came out trying to figure out which pages you needed to update. Like, I mean, it led me to finding, back then, referencing the highlighters, it led me to finding better software to like compare the entire PowerSchool web root from one version to another, to my own version, so that I could compare whole directories and see what had changed and what I needed to update and what I needed to copy over. Whereas now it's very rare that I have to deal with a non-insertion point / page fragment customization, which it just makes life so much easier. Less headaches
for the client and the developer. Another point with customization, with insertion points and page fragments, is cohabitation.
Yep.
You can have 5 different customizations all adding links to the system reports page, and they can all live together in harmony, assuming they don't still have a PS5 Yankee stripe version of the system reports page that doesn't have an insertion point on it.
Right.
Or the more too.
There you go. Oh gosh, man, don't even get me started. But so I got to say, I agree with your assessment, Ryan, of kind of the different class of database extensions and insertion points versus custom page management. But I do think custom page management was huge, especially when I think back to the days when I was working with districts that were hosted by PowerSchool. And when they wanted to customize something, they had to bundle up the file, email it to PowerSchool, and say, put this in my custom web root.
Yep.
And then if it doesn't work, well,
kidding.
You fix it and email it again. So, I mean, that is huge, especially, I think, for those hosted districts. Now, myself, I don't ever use custom page management. It's far easier when I have access to my server to use the custom web. Right. But in addition to that, you made me think of something else, Sean, when you brought up CPM, and we talk about custom insertion points and page fragments and these customizations intermingling. I don't know why. I've been thinking about preparing for this episode for the last 2 weeks, and the thought that plugins were introduced never occurred to me until just 2 minutes ago.
Oh yeah. Well, I wrote it down on my notes, but you're right. We haven't even talked about that.
I mean, how many people? I know you don't want to. You were trying to avoid name dropping, so I'll say, I remember conversations with folks like Schmeish and Schmredwell.
I was wondering if that would be the one.
About, back in the day with the custom reports bundle, which was hosted by Power Data Solutions, which was a product. Solutions. What's that?
Schmauer Schmadish Solutions.
Yes, exactly. But, you think about it, things change. People want to take out, they're like, oh, there's a new version of the custom reports bundle.
Yeah.
How do you sift through?
Most people just kept whatever they initially installed.
Right. And now with a plugin, it's like, no, just disable, enable, delete, reinstall. It all the resources that are part of a customization are now associated with one another. That was a huge thing that I don't know why when I've been thinking over the last 2 weeks about the evolution, that one wasn't one in the forefront.
And that precursed the actual insertion points, because the plugins were hugely beneficial, absolutely, for everything you just said there. And actually, let me quickly circle back to the CPM. I can almost say, like, legitimately, I took it for granted, because I started in PowerSchool with CPM, and we hosted our own server back then, but I never had to deal with the custom web root. My only experiences with the custom web root were when I would be supporting, and this is throughout my employments, following it with the district, would be supporting customers who say they've got this weird this weird code happening or weird functions happening, and I would eventually deduce that this is something being introduced from your custom web route, not CPM, and then I'd tell them to go onto their server, and then they'd find it.
Yeah.
So that was really my experience with it. So it's almost like from my perspective, the custom web route was only ever a hindrance. Well, just because of the fact that only times I ever dealt with it was to help people figure out what the heck was going wrong. And I mean, now that honestly, and I was telling you this to Eric the other day, now that I've been here at MBA, I've been using the web route a lot more. It makes life way easier to use it. It's but it's almost to a fault, in that I mean, it's like on one hand, it's the right way to do things if you're just speaking of the overall way to develop for the web. On the other hand, for PowerSchool, it makes me lazy because now I have to keep track of another set of files almost in a way. It's hard to explain, like the plugins, because this now goes back to the plugins. The plugins are a nice way to update those files, install the plugin, and update those files, install the plugin, do it up. And they made it real easy because I don't have to sit there in CPM and constantly paste in from the text editors. I can use my own text editor, package the zip, throw it in, and then do it. And I prefer to do it that way rather than do it in CPM, because I don't like the copy pasting back and forth either. And then back to the custom web route. Now I do have to remember to do a little bit of cutting and pasting. Although I know, Eric, you've got that down to a science with your scripts there, which you should almost talk about. But for me, I haven't even bothered. I haven't gone down that route yet. I'm still just doing it the way I'm doing it. But yeah.
We should talk about that sometime, right? Because I've leveraged tools in my text editor. So I have all my files for a given plugin that I'm working on, not sitting on the server. They're sitting on my local hard drive. But I have an intelligent text editor with a plugin installed that syncs up my a folder on my hard drive to the custom web route on the server. You bring up
server. We should point out, not just anyone, but I mean that's the one you always do your development on.
Right. The development server, and you bring up a good point where it kind of makes you lazy. But I heard from one of my instructors back in school, like, good web developers are lazy.
That is true.
I mean, I'll spend 3 hours today tinkering around with something, because I know it's going to save me 5 minutes a day for the foreseeable future.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It pays dividends. It's just time well spent.
Yeah, and bring this back, kind of both on topic, but back to resources. When you guys are talking about plugins, that became a huge thing for me when plugins became a thing, is for using PowerSource Exchange as a resource. Instead of, as a non-developer person working in a district, hey, I have this problem, I need to find a solution. That was the first place I'd go to, see if somebody else already did it. You would talk about lazy. It's how about you just not do it at all and just take somebody else's. Mm-hmm. And that was always a great resource.
And learning,
when I teach customization, I always tell people rule number one of customization is don't build it if you can steal it.
Yep.
And then I talk about PowerSource Exchange. Yeah, absolutely.
There is a very specific, I'll paraphrase somehow here. I'm not going to get the quote right, but it's not stealing, it's collaborating. That was Shmeev Schmeibert from the PSU is always, that was his one of his lines. I always respected that one. It's stuck with me through the years for sure.
Well, hey guys, I think that's a good place to stop. Unless there's anything that you feel necessary we need to talk about. But yeah, I think that was a great kind of look back on how PowerSchool's kind of evolved and where we fit into the evolution of PowerSchool code. So thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Well, I just wanted to, before you close off, tell people to tell us what their thoughts are and whether they agree or disagree, and give us their questions.
For sure. Let us know.
Sure. Let us know what they think.
All right. Take care, guys.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Enjoy more episodes and learn more at mba-link.com.